I've been conducting participant observation fieldwork with a team of ethnographers. Let me see if I think, yeah. With a team of ethnographers, Lori Hart, George Carandinos, Fernando Montero Castrillo, since the fall of 2007 on a block in the predominantly Puerto Rican section of North Philadelphia, where both Fernando and George, the two young guys at the end, were living up until just 2 months ago. Now, 47% of the residents in the census tract that we're in have annual incomes below the poverty line, almost twice the citywide rate of 24%, and 3.5 times the national rate of 13.5%. 3 of the census tracts surrounding us have poverty rates of over 54%, and 5 of the 8 poorest census tracts in the city are in the Puerto Rican section of North Philadelphia. They're the poorest ethnic group in the city. Philadelphia is also the poorest of the 10 largest cities in the United States, and it's lost residents every single year since 1951 until last year, when it ambiguously gained residents, but primarily through population accrual, reproduction, biological reproduction, not immigration, which is what you want to gain with. Demographers identify the city as one of the 5 hyper-segregated metropolises in the United States, and Puerto Ricans migrated to Philadelphia in large numbers immediately after World War II, seeking the factory jobs that were disappearing during the next 3 decades. As in many U.S. inner cities beset by deindustrialization and public and private sector disinvestment, the drug economy filled the economic vacuum left by deindustrialization. And not coincidentally, the formerly industrial core of the city, to which Puerto Rican immigrants had headed, has become the region's largest open-air drug market for heroin and powder cocaine, and actually this is a picture of crack, but it's primarily heroin and powder cocaine. It serves primarily white injectors from other impoverished Philadelphia neighborhoods and the tri-state regional suburban sprawl, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. It's very conveniently located on all the highways and also the public transportation. I know this, as I was saying, this is an HIV researcher audience, and I apologize for not giving a more hardcore HIV talk. But what's happened is I'm in the midst of a long-term HIV prevention study analyzing the HIV risk environment by trying to set violence, hypersegregation, poverty, deindustrialization, and the details of the mechanisms of the zero-tolerance war on drugs and then the effects of hyper-incarceration at the center of the structuring of that HIV risk environment. But because of Leif's prompting, and because I'm actually super interested in this and I want to take advantage of what you know to run this by you, it's a hypothesis really with respect to this HIV risk environment. I think it's an especially important city and specifically a neighborhood for public health to study, because it's not entirely bad news from an HIV perspective. It should have absolutely horrendous, an absolutely horrendous HIV infection rate. It's in the largest U.S. city. I mean, it's in the U.S. of the large U.S. cities in the United States. Philadelphia has the highest HIV rate and the most heterosexual HIV rate. And Philadelphia specifically has had a long-term it's had a very long-term powder heroin epidemic, but more specifically, it's had a powder cocaine epidemic that we don't see as intensely in other cities. And what we learned from before crack in the early 1980s. Is that the variable that most closely associates, most proximally associates with seroconversion is HIV, is cocaine injection. And those of us that have had the made the mistake of spending time in cocaine shooting galleries, can attest to how extraordinarily bloody the logistics of cocaine injection become. The unfortunate sort of the physiological effect of cocaine is precisely to constrict your veins. And also, you can't absorb it unless it goes into your vein when you inject it. If you miss your vein, it just disintegrates and gets metabolized out without getting you high. So people are absolutely desperate to get it into their vein, and they have to keep poking as time progresses because their veins are resisting the cocaine more and more. As a matter of fact, it's used in surgery precisely as a vasoconstrictor to stop bleeding. But the result is extremely bloody injections, and because of the multiple poking. And when someone's on a binge, they're specifically looking for, they're ready to inject literally minutes after their last injection if they have enough money and if there's cocaine around. So it can become very, very chaotic. But surprisingly, HIV, Philadelphia doesn't have. It has a high HIV epidemic, but it's not super high like I expected it to be, the way Vancouver became and the way Montreal became during their cocaine injections. And I think that the reason is that when I first came, I thought it was sort of an incompetent needle exchange program. It actually works. They have a de facto policy of promoting secondary exchange, and people come literally exchanging suitcasefuls of syringes. And as a result, there's a whole sector of injectors whose income is entirely generated by reselling needles from the needle exchange. And what that results in is 24 hours, 24/7, there's a person standing on every single path leading to every single shooting gallery, literally shouting out, "Works, works, works." And you can get them at any hour for 50 cents a piece, and if you're patient enough, you can get 10 for $1 from a wholesaler, and that's how they're supplied. So they're actually extraordinarily accessible, which is a nice phenomenon. The other thing is that Philadelphia has a lot of sort of semi-corrupt buprenorphine doctors, and what that results in is a secondary distribution of buprenorphine, one of the Suboxone, which is then hawked on the way to all these shooting galleries as well, so that when someone hasn't been able to get the money, mug someone, or whatever it is, that however they get the money, instead of having to be pushed to do something desperate, they can buy some discount buprenorphine and stay without withdrawal symptoms for 24 hours, 48 hours even. So there's these sort of accidental free market interfaces have actually been, I think, very positive, because I just can't understand how it's possible. Literally, you have miles of open air. This particular open air shooting gallery is literally, I don't know if it's a mile or a mile and a half long. It's the train tracks leading to the semi-defunct port, and it's just it's full of people and full of needles all along the train tracks. So now, what's the other interface that's taking place are two very high-risk populations, which is young whites who are just entering into the epidemic, who then the women begin engaging in the local sex markets, and they're rather inexperienced. In this case, she can't even hit herself with her cocaine. And then with older Puerto Rican injectors who are coming from the region of America that has the highest HIV rate in the country, because Puerto Rico itself, tragically, has had even longer term powder cocaine epidemic than the mainland. So, given those ingredients, I would have expected a much higher HIV rate. So that's just what I wanted to just throw out in some sense. And now I'm going to enter into the more anthro talk. Let me see where I jumped to here. Oh yeah. Now the other dynamic that's taking place is the whites that are entering into the epidemic are coming from the other poor neighborhoods, and they're transitioning from opiate pills, from diverted opiate pills that'll become relevant in the second half of this talk, and that's something that's happening on a national level. And very interestingly, the young African Americans and Puerto Ricans who are also getting addicted to codeine and diverted opiate pills, Percocet primarily in the case of Pennsylvania, because that's what's on the Medicare formulary, are not transitioning for the most part to injection. But unfortunately, it's sort of the hip and cool thing to do on a Saturday night for high school kids is to take Percocets, at least in Pennsylvania. And they're not quite aware that it's heroin. They don't realize that it gets you physically addicted in some sense. As a matter of fact, they argue with me, telling me I don't know what I'm talking about. They say, no, that's more like Valium. That's more like dope. But anyhow. And the young men, the young sellers often discover that they're addicted only after they get arrested and enter into withdrawal, because it's the first time that they haven't had access to a steady supply of pills. So now, what I'm going to be talking about then is that the multi-million-dollar drug market valorizes the cultural skills, knowledges of the streets, and ability to mobilize violence of the most impoverished members of the inner city, but then condemns them to lives of chronic incarceration in the context of our state's very aggressive war on drugs. Now, in a nutshell, I'm bringing Bourdieu's concept of habitus formation across social fields to bear, and this is a little bit of jargon, and you don't have to pay attention to this part, to bear on Marx's concept of primitive accumulation and reframe Foucault's biopower to explain the imposition of high levels of interpersonal and criminal violence in this high HIV risk neighborhood, where the state's intervention is dominated by, on the one hand, massive investment in hyper-incarceration, and, on the other hand, a more recent biopolitical shift to managing poverty and civility by subsidizing diagnoses for pathology that require pharmaceutical medication. And I developed this paper because I just couldn't wrap my head around why the U.S. mode of neoliberal governmentality continues to foster so many chronic health diseases, so much interpersonal and institutional violence, and infrastructural destruction. And I said there must be something that makes it want to keep doing this on some level. And I think I'll be able to show that a great deal of capital does get accumulated through the process of specifically destroying, confining, and disabling bodies and lives. Much of it, a part of that actually gets channeled and accumulated in the medical and big pharma sectors, and that'll be the last part of the talk. So on the street, then, a reputation for mobilizing violence, as many of us have written, Elijah and so forth, a reputation for mobilizing violence and rage effectively becomes a form of cultural capital that translates into useful social capital through networks of reciprocity based on kinship, friendship, romance, and utilitarian economics. In another article, I've argued that this elevated level of personal and criminal violence is not a deviant act. It's embedded in a set of concrete moral economy logics. Violence becomes both a risk and a resource to be managed intimately through social relations that require kin and friends to reciprocate obligations of assistive violence to protect one another's reputations and self-respect and physical security. Now, on most days, the neighborhood feels like a very friendly place. Many of our neighbors respond to the routine boredom that unemployment and poverty impose by investing their energy in warm sociability, and in that process develop friendships as well as vulnerabilities and obligations for mutual assistive violence. Spectacular incidents of violence, consequently, irregularly erupt in the midst of a very dense sociality. Within a 2-month period, for example, during our first spring, there were 15 shootings, 3 of them fatal, within 4 blocks of our apartment. There were also 3 stabbings and 11 more aggravated assaults. The following 4 springs now, have been just as violent and just as spectacular. About 2 months ago, a 17-year-old friend of ours helped a friend of his stab a 20-year-old neighbor 20 times to his death for selling counterfeit $10 packets of heroin with our block's stamp on it. That's our block stamp, or was a while back. It changes constantly. Initially, we were tempted to attribute these high levels of violence primarily to the instrumental need for control of the highly profitable but officially unregulated illegal open-air drug economy that is so visible immediately throughout the neighborhood. In fact, while many killings are indeed related to the enforcement of territorial market control, to debt disputes, many, if not most of the violence is more proximally, if you want, explained and experienced by most of the participants as an assertion of self-respect or as a momentary submission to uncontrollable rage. When people discuss fights with us retrospectively, it is often framed with, I blacked out, me cegué, I went blind, I went crazy, I spazzed out, my mind went blank, the devil in me came out. It is understood as a personality attribute that's out of their control. Yet it explains also their ability to mobilize violence effectively. And it's also on some level a demand, a warning to you to respect them. I'll be making 2 arguments about how state policies cultivate rage. The first and most obvious is that our overcrowded prisons have become gladiator schools for violence that trap young men in a closed loop, confining them to a violent economy of drugs and crime. That first part of my argument, I think, is on some level somewhat self-evident. So I'll only provide one brief ethnographic example to elaborate, so that we have more time to elaborate the second argument about the shift from welfare to SSI through diagnoses of violent cognitive disability. And that's been taking place ever since the decimation of welfare in the mid to late 1990s. Okay, so I'll do first the prison part. Tito, a 21-year-old neighbor, that's not Tito, serving 8 years in prison for accidentally shooting his best friend while drunk, recalled to us on the eve of his sentencing how Don Ricardo, a 50-year-old neighbor and reformed ex-bichote. Bichote is the Puerto Rican word. It's a colonial Puerto Rican word for big shot from when the Americans used to come over, and they still do come over and boss everyone around. And it's ingrained linguistically. He pinned a disrespectful young drug seller on the ground and shot his handgun in the sidewalk next to the young man's head while ordering him to leave the block. I'm telling you, Tito says in admiration, Don Ricardo's got heart, nobody messes with him. Tito recounted this story in a prison holding cell where he was facing his first prison sentence as an adult. He's a short, baby-faced 20-year-old and was groping for strategies on how to best navigate the inevitable high-stakes violent conflicts that are routine to everyday prison life, especially for men of his physical appearance. And so these are field notes from that George and Fernando wrote up from that visit. Tito has scratches and bruises on his face, but walks into the visiting room smiling when he sees us. He exclaims, "Man, am I happy to see you. Because if you guys would have come a bit later, I would have come down here in shackles. I got in a fight today with some bull. Look, he even bit me." He raises his shirt, revealing a deep crimson circular bruise in the center of his chest. "I was in my cell, and this nigga came in and just snuck, that means punched, me in the back of the head, and then stood there looking at me like I wasn't going to do anything. But when he put his hands on me, he brought out the devil. It was like the devil just took a hold of me. My mind went blank, and I jumped on him. And he dropped his banger, that's a homemade shank, prison knife. And I said, 'Oh, this bull is trying to stab me up.' I guess because I came in there minding my own business, quiet. Then they saw me that I was small. People think that they can mess with me. I know if I came in here like a savage, then they wouldn't have thought that. I know it. That's what I get for trying to keep to myself. People think you're a pussy. The CO, this is him continuing. CO is the correctional officer, the prison guard, locked the cell and let us fight it out so we didn't get in trouble. But when I saw he had the banger, the shank, the enemy he was fighting against, I said, don't lock us in, but the CO did anyhow. Not all COAs are like that. You have to know who is cool and will let you fight and who is going to send you to the hole. What's amazing about that is just the contrary interpretation. And this really literally is a gladiator school. So he's thankful to the CO for having locked him into the, because the alternative in our prisons now is solitary confinement for both of you, which is, a total bummer. The situations are really beyond what one can imagine in terms of how violence gets forced onto you and how it gets actually enjoyed in grotesque ways by some of the guards, at least, or who do them the favor of not putting them in solitary confinement as a gentle alternative. Okay. So this unit, this is the Philadelphia sprawling county jail system. And you know what's really gross? This was the original one, right? The Foucault-style panopticon. And so Foucault actually, it actually came to, that's the case study he studied in Madness and Civilization was Philadelphia's jail. It's actually not this one, but they built another one. And that's what they had. Then when Philadelphia started losing population in 1950, instead of investing in doing something about losing its population, they then built, in response to that, with deindustrialization, started building all these other jails. Meanwhile, Philadelphia lost something like 600,000 people, and just instead of investing in itself, invested in this carceral complex. It had in 2006, it had the highest per capita incarceration rate at the county jail level of any county in the country. Okay, so he goes, this unit is crazy, man. A lot of people don't know what's going on yet with their case. They're stressing. They have that uncertainty. They don't know if they're going to go home soon or if they aren't ever going to go home. Now, I might end up killing this nigga, because when I get mad, and I don't really know what I'm doing. I was like that out in the street, too. I would get mad at any little thing and just lose it, go into a rage. But I'm happy with how I've handled myself in here. I'm not going to lie, though. I felt better about the fight. I had so much building up, man, it felt kind of good to let it all out. Now, as sociologists and criminologists have documented, the explosion of the U.S. carceral system since 1980, with an over five-fold increase since Reagan's election, and also, coincidental with that, also an institutional shift, a conscious institutional shift, away from rehabilitation and towards punishment, reduction in education services, treatment programs, and so forth in the prison context. Most grotesquely, this massive rise has nothing to do with the actual, objective, quote-unquote, security of the general population. Even as crime goes down, especially violent crime, you have the population increasing. So it's taken on a logic completely of its own without any internal consistency. Now, I think actually in this sense that it can be understood as a perverse form of primitive accumulation, because capital is actually extracted or at least concentrated and moved around in society from this process. But it's done not by exploiting, in the old-fashioned Marxist conception of the surplus value of the labor force of those who are incarcerated, but rather by precisely lowering their cultural capital and expelling them in the long term from the legal labor market. Because what it does, of course, the prison experience is it augments your violent capital and it positions you for an immediate re-entry into street crime. Ex-offenders, who often do strive to break the criminal and violent cycle, find it very difficult, obviously, to re-enter the legal labor market upon their release. Their criminal record exacerbated by the low skill level imposed by several years of forced idleness in a purposefully hostile prison environment that's devoid of rehabilitative programs condemns them then to chronic unemployment. And Pennsylvania, to make it easier to keep people out of the labor force for all employers, puts all your information up on a website. So anyone that applies for a job, you just punch in. You don't need their prison number. Just their first name, last name, and date of birth is enough. And you repeatedly get stories from people in our neighborhood who get a job because sometimes it takes a while for them to run these checks. They'll be working for 3 to 6 months, doing a good job and so forth, and then they'll just get fired because of the official policy of the corporation that they're employed with. Okay, so now for the subtler part then of my argument. There's been a biopolitical shift in the management of extreme poverty that increasingly mediates access to subsidies through psychiatric diagnosis. And that diagnosis is easiest to obtain when one suffers from out-of-control violent rage. As my friends describe it, they describe picking up objects from the desks of their counselors and throwing the objects around the room. And they'll say, that's what I do, and that works. In contrast to the obviously brutal right hand of the state's carceral mismanagement of poverty, this medical left hand of the state's management of inner-city poverty and unemployment, which is spearheaded by dedicated social workers who are working overtime, really working hard to help poor people, and psychiatrists who are diagnosing personal rage in an attempt to convert people who have become, since the reform of welfare, the unworthy poor, and convert them instead into the pathological poor in order to facilitate access to minimal survival subsidies through SSI through a diagnosis of permanent cognitive disability. And this has the side effect of making then scary, violent, distressed individuals into stable patients, relatively stable patients, who are also eligible for valuable pharmaceutical prescriptions, along with the SSI check that they receive. And especially well-organized and conscientious physicians urine test their violent patients to make sure that they're actually taking their medications, some of which, some of the atypical antipsychotics that they get prescribed to them, have the unfortunate side effect of making someone who takes it for a long time diabetic and obese. It's an especially preoccupying, unintended negative health time bomb for the growing number of children diagnosed in elementary school, sometimes with just simple diagnoses like, with harmless diagnoses like ADHD, or relatively harmless diagnoses like ADHD, and other psychological disorders, who some of them are prescribed atypical antipsychotics and forced to take their medications by their parents, lest they lose the Social Security check that then enables the parent the family to have a minimal survival. To re-summarize then, my structural argument, the diagnosis of uncontrollable violent rage has become one of the last means for exerting citizenship claims on the resources of the vestigial U.S. welfare state. Single men and women can no longer qualify for stable welfare payments. Our Tea Party governor canceled all payments to single men, even when they're in rehab, addicted to drugs and so forth, on August 1st, actually. unless they're certified as insane or quadriplegic, and then they can enter into the SSI. What's amazing with SSI is also getting harder and harder and harder to get, which then pushes more and more people into the violent insane category. So right now, if you're paraplegic with your 2 legs and your hand, but you can move your arm, they'll only give you 2/3 of your SSI check, because they say you could do something with that other hand to make money. It's an absolutely insanely punitive system. And on the other hand, a cognitive diagnosis actually is something that sticks, or that can stick, especially when it's unambiguous, because you come in with scars on your body from self-mutilation and bruises, or you get arrested in those processes of beating someone up, and have the good luck of getting shifted to through progressive diversionary programs from prison into treatment, which is increasingly occurring as well. Now, you get a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or when in San Francisco, the doctors who are more leftist, they diagnose it as PTSD. I'm going to read a field note from, it was right in the beginning of my field work. This was my first meeting with my downstairs neighbor. Our downstairs neighbor, Manny, introduces himself somewhat shyly to me by announcing that he was nicknamed El Samurai during his youth in Puerto Rico for his knife-fighting skills. Perhaps because I failed to express enough interest in his story, he catches my attention a minute later by blurting out an unprompted non sequitur. Y soy maníaco y depresivo y esquizofrénico también. I'm manic and depressive and schizophrenic also. He then breaks into a warm smile, twists his head awkwardly to the side, and gapes his mouth wide open with his eyeballs tilted, transforming himself instantaneously into a convincing caricature of a psychotic patient. The problem is he doesn't quite stop doing that afterwards. The shy earnestness of Manny's self-revelation and his simultaneous embrace of being both an effective knife fighter and a diagnosed psychiatric patient confuses me at first. In fact, it makes me a bit nervous when he then moves his 360-pound frame closer to me, his eyes beginning to flit anxiously to the right and the left, and he tells me that he has a devil inside him. And then, with growing anger resonating in his voice, he describes being tasered by the police a few months ago while he was sitting on the stoop of our apartment building smoking a cigarette. The cop rushed me, and I held up my hands to show him I had nothing and said, no inglés. He can't speak English. Right? So, no inglés. The cop thought I was selling coke just because I was sitting in front of my house, but I wasn't that day. We had run out. So he tasers me in the neck, right on my artery. And he does it again and again, hitting me on my chest too, something like 20 times. I crumpled to the ground and they handcuffed me. And that's when they started beating me with their clubs, pointing to the sidewalk at the bottom of the steps. I'm not a well man. I'm sick. I'm schizophrenic and manic depressive, and I take medications for all of that. So that was crazy what they did. He points to the discolored skin on his neck from the taser hits. His wife interrupts in English. They're supposed to taser you in fatty areas, but they kept hitting him on his neck arteries. He says it felt like his blood was boiling from the first hit. We have pictures of Manny afterwards, and we're suing. See, she was raised in the United States. She understands the American dream, and, getting a lawsuit for the rest of your life and so forth. But the trouble is she doesn't have the cultural capital to be able to fulfill that American dream. So what the police simply did is what they always do in these cases of extraordinary brutality. They put resisting arrest charges on Manny, and they won their case, and he is now on the run and no longer taking his medication. Both men and women have had a habitus or subjectivity of sensitivity to insult and facility for mobilizing out-of-control disrespect-induced rage imposed on them I'm arguing to summarize. The everyday emergency of economic, interpersonal, chemical, and institutional violence in the U.S. inner city encourages local residents to hone violent techniques of the body, ranging from aggressive posturing, skillful fisticuffs, dissociative rage, to pride in surviving and inflicting severe beatings, and in the case of men, courage and excitements during shootouts. Now, why would something like this, generate or accumulate capital or concentrate money? The millions of dollars of cash that concentrate onto desolate inner city corners by open-air drug markets, and that's what's so bizarre about this neighborhood. You can't imagine a poor-looking neighborhood. It's just, every other house is destroyed. Huge factories, sometimes they're 1 or 2 blocks large, that were literally mills that are decaying, that the city doesn't have enough money or doesn't care about enough to even do. The cornices are falling off and killing people occasionally, and so forth. Or they just spontaneously burn from people living in them with candles and so forth. And despite that, you have just massive amounts of money, a multi-million, daily coming in onto the block, with people running in from the whole region with dollars in their hand to spend those dollars on these drug corners. So it's, you literally see the money coming running in. It's like swarms of people marching in from the subways and from the from where they've parked their cars and so forth. And also, a lot of them then become homeless as addicts, and then they just mill around in the neighborhood, turning it into a multicultural neighborhood, ironically. So that's one obvious part, right, of this this dynamic of primitive accumulation, where the drug industry's profit margins come from, as the economists would tell us, the inelastic demand of the addicted bodies of clients. And also, I think more importantly, the scarcity effects of zero-tolerance law enforcement. And then, of course, the straightforward brutality of wannabe monopoly drug lords who have no recourse to state mediation to stabilize markets peacefully. And then these street-level profits trickle up and out of out into the legal economy, primarily to lawyers and parasitical carceral services. Hyper-visible street violence and addiction trigger massive public resource transfers through taxes to fund our court systems, fund our police forces, our unionized guards. They're the second largest political action corporation in California, the Guard Union. And then, of course, carceral construction contracts, and then petty stuff. That all of this creates an even larger mass base for supporting this insane carceralization process. I don't know if you saw it. The Bloomberg, one of those finance publications, says the most profitable telephone industry is the carceral telephone industry, which is owned by 2 corporations, one of which is Goldman Sachs. And they basically charging incredibly poor people, because it's an inelastic demand. You get 15 minutes, whatever it is, once a week and so forth to make your call, and people are willing to pay anything. And of course, that part of it is privatized. Psychiatrists and social workers and big pharma then benefit from their expanding SSI and Medicaid subsidized market, diagnosing the criminally insane and dispensing prescriptions. Diverted pills then recruit new clients for the narcotics industry and foster new violent addiction markets on the street. And as I mentioned earlier, this year, diverted opiate, oh no, I didn't mention this. This year, diverted opiate pills were the single biggest cause of fatal overdoses in the United States. So this is occurring on a national level. This isn't something that's Philadelphia specific. The utility of the production of capital extends well beyond dollars, though. And this is where it extends into sense. That is to say, it seeps into the common sense of what becomes desirable in family, friends, lovers, and sadly even in children. Violence anchors lumpenized subjectivities, unmoored from long-term stable reproductive options, and repeatedly rejected whenever they try to make an attempt to become productive citizens. The traditional unworthy poor are increasingly becoming disabled sociopaths in order to gain legitimacy as a redemption strategy. And as I've heard several people yell over the years, don't mess with me, I'm crazy and I got the papers to prove it. So I'll stop there so we have time for talks, for questions rather.